judging. Now, you're going to think that this passage, well, I don't know, Peter, how this is relevant to us, because we don't really think about worshiping on another day other than Sunday. It's not an issue that we deal with, and we don't have a deal with a problem with different kinds of eating habits. What should we eat? What should we not eat? So why is this relevant to us? Well, let me give you my take on this. Now, I've got a number of things that happened to me over the past few weeks, and I'm going to let you think about them, and you get to decide whether I can judge these people or they can judge me without sinning, as Jesus talked about in Matthew 7, 1 and 2. In Matthew 7, 1 and 2, this verse everyone will remember, "For do not judge so that you will not be judged. For in the way you judge, you will be judged. And by your standard of measure, it will be measured to you." And it goes on to say about don't look at don't forget the log in your own eye when you're thinking about the speck in the other person's eye. Well, if you look at this verse without looking anywhere else, it's kind of hard not to. You can be reasonably convinced that the world is right when they say, you shouldn't judge me. Do you know what? I don't want to hear your judgmental attitude. Don't you know what Jesus said? And then they repeat this verse, the most memorized verse of any non-Christian is, "Judge not that ye be not judged." And so they say that out loud, and then you think about it and you hang your head in shame. So, are you ready? You get to decide whether these examples that I'm going to quote, how I should be able to judge, and if it was you, how you would judge them without sinning. So these are just examples. You would come up with many of your own. Anyway, someone in my neighborhood walks their dog, and you know the whole idea. In the city, when you walk your dog, you've got a doggy bag in your pocket, and you pick up that mess, and you turn it inside out, and you tie it, and then you throw it in the middle of the sidewalk. Well, no, that's not usually the way you do it. You take it home and you put it in your garbage. But this person, he leaves it, or she leaves it, in the middle of the sidewalk for somebody to step on. And it's there for months. And so Friday, I was walking to visit Dad, and here's a nice, new, fresh doggy-doo bag for somebody to walk on in the middle of the night and go. Now, so you get to judge. Well, how should I judge this person? Or should I judge him at all? Thou shalt not judge. So the second one was, I worked all week. My arms sore from lifting stuff, and I worked all week, got back to the office. They said, you have to do some billing because there's none been done and you haven't been in the office, and get it done. And so at 4:45, I'm ready to go home, really. And the phone rings, and I said, should I pick that up or let it go? So I picked it up, and a customer we deal with all the time, 15 years, he calls no one else, says, Peter, the man-door people, that's the guys, not my crew, the other crew came and installed the door, and they didn't tell us in advance they were coming, and there's an alarm on the door, and they cut it off, and the wire's off, and they just put it in the cup on the floor. And now the people that are in the building can't set the alarm. And you have to go. You have to get somebody there to put that little... So there's no one. I have no idea who installed it, how to get a hold of them. Was it even our guys, or was it a subcontractor? So I have to do that. So Friday afternoon at 5 o'clock, I spent the next hour putting the alarm back on. Number 3 was, I was driving to a job site, or I can't remember if I was driving anyway, and there's a nice turn-off lane, so the guy that's turning right goes into another lane, and then everybody scoots by. And so this guy, he's got a signal light on, everything's good so far, and he's turning into this other lane, But instead of going over quickly and being in the other lane so the rest of all the other people behind him can go through the green light, he travels both lanes. And he slows down really, really, really slow, and then finally at the very last minute, he turns in and goes around the corner. And all of us wait for the next light because he used up all that time. The fourth one is, I'm driving on Von Harvey Boulevard, which is 2 lanes each way, and they've got the inside lane blocked, and I'm in the outside lane, and everybody in the inside lane is stopped, and the car ahead of me lets, you know how you let somebody in and then you go and he let 2 cars in. So I said, well, it's not this person in the other lane's turn, we just let 2 in, so she can wait for the next. Anyway, she had very colorful words to say about me, and I drove past that didn't let her in. And the funny thing is, the next person, of course, let her in. It was her turn. And we went up to the next light, but she was turning, and she went through the light ahead of me. And so all of her anger and rude was to no effect. She still was ahead of me. So anyway, those are the 4 things that, and you have lots of them, probably yourself. Now, I used to stop and let people in all the time. I would stop and let somebody in front of me. And now what I do is I look in the mirror, I see them wanting in, I look in the mirror and there's nobody behind me, they can come in behind me. It's no different before me or so. But now if there's a long line of cars and I'm stopped and should I let this person in, I think to myself, yeah, that's a nice gesture, but what about the people behind me? They're waiting patiently, and I've let 5 cars in, and now they're angry. So it doesn't matter what I do, I'm making someone wait. Either the people behind me that have the right of way or the people that are coming in. I make somebody wait. And on top of all of that, if I let somebody in and they get in an accident because of it, like we did in Truro, somebody let us go, bang. You're responsible. You let them in, you now are responsible, you get to pay the damage to their car and the other car. And so you have to be very careful. Anyway, so you see with these things should be very simple. It should be easy to figure out how you judge somebody and who's the right and wrong. But it's not that easy. It's easy to get it wrong. Now, if I had said it all comes down to the intent of your heart. So think about that as if I was mean to that woman instead of letting her in, then the intent of my heart was wrong and I was judging her improperly. Well, let's look at this passage now. Number 1 is the food fight. Chapter 14, 1-4 says, "Now accept the one who is weak in the faith, but not for the purpose of passing judgment on his opinions. One person has faith that he may eat all things, but he who is weak eats vegetables only. And the one who eats is not to regard with contempt the one who does not eat, and the one who does not eat is not to judge the one who eats, for God has accepted him. Who are you to judge the servant of another? To his own master he stands or falls, and he will stand, for the Lord is able to make him stand." You see in that 4 verses it says, the purpose of passing judgment or holding in him in contempt. That's the crux of the issue, is judging him in that way. Do you remember Peter went to the house of Simon the tanner? He was staying there, and he was asleep on the roof, waiting for dinner, and God gave him a vision of a tarp coming down from heaven with all these unclean animals, and God says to him, "Kill and eat." And he says, "I have never eaten anything unclean." And God does it 3 times. He has to convince him that the rules have changed, Peter. I've changed these things. Now, for us, this whole idea of what clean and unclean food, in 2019, how is it pertinent to our culture? And for the most part, in Riverside, Albert, it's not. But if we happen to be in a multicultural area with all sorts of people from other countries coming, I was in Costco, and there's goats hanging up in Costco. Now, the goats are obviously dead and frozen in the freezer, but they say halal goats. They're for Muslims. So if the Muslim who has become a Christian was part of your community and you said, well, I was in and I bought this food, and he's saying to himself, well, in order for it to be halal, there were certain things done to it. It had a blessing to Allah said over it, so it made it out. And so I can't eat that. And you would have to understand that that verse is pertinent to him. Do you remember Daniel, when he came to Babylon, he said, I don't want to eat this food that's not right for us to eat. So he came to the guy that was looking after him and said, can we eat vegetables? And the guy says, no, I'd get killed. And he said, give us 10 days. And if we're not healthier and better looking than all the others, then we'll eat the food. You see, this wasn't so much, we can't eat the food. This was offering God the chance to do a miracle. God, I want to obey you, but you have to step in and intervene and make those guys look bad and us look so good that the guy says, there's no question here. I'm going to let you do this. Well, number 2 is, toss the day question in also. In verse 5 and 6, it says, one day regards one day above the other, another regards every day alike. Every person must be fully convinced in his own mind. He who observes the day observes it for the Lord, and he who eats does it for the Lord, for he gives thanks to God. And he who eats not for the Lord, he does not eat, and gives thanks to the Lord. Now this is the Sabbath versus the first day of the week thing. And as I say, well, we don't really think about that. There's some 7-day Adventists in Moncton, and that's a concern. But for the most part, it's just something that was very relevant for Paul, and he threw it into the mix. He said, let's think about this. But really, it isn't as important as actually worshiping God. And I thought to myself, so there's a Jewish man who becomes, or a Jewish family that becomes Christian, and now everyone in the Christian faith observes the first day of the week, but I don't feel right not observing the Sabbath. And so he comes to his employer and says, I know that everybody else here in the company works 7 days a week, and I appreciate the fact that you gave me the Sabbath off because I'm Jewish, but now I've become a Christian and I want 2 days off a week. And I appreciate it if you made my paycheck, fix that up so I don't lose any money. I don't know how well that would go, really. And he'd have to choose one day or the other. And God says, whichever day you choose is fine. Well, number 3 is just dying to sort this out. Verse 7 to 9 says, not one of us who lives for himself, and not one of us dies for himself. And if we live, we live for the Lord, and if we die for the Lord. Therefore, whether we live or die, we are the Lord's. For to this end, Christ died and lived again, and he might be Lord of both the dead and the living. Now, the biggest question that, except being saved, for most people, the biggest question that they have in life is, am I going to live or die? And really, you have no say in that. God has the entire say whether you will go out and hit one of the Albert County deers on the way home and get killed, or you will get a pass today. You don't have a say. And so if this most important question you don't get to say, why do you want to make food or a particular day a hill to die on? So just let it go. It belongs to the Lord, and His is the final say. Number 4 is, just let me tell you about my obsession. Verse 10 says, but you, why do you judge your brother? Or you again, why do you regard your brother with contempt? There's that word contempt again. For we all stand before the judgment seat of God. For it is written, as I live, says the Lord, every knee shall bow to me, and every tongue shall give praise to the Lord. So then each one of us will give an account of himself to God. And I thought about this, and I made this person up. And so you have to, so this person says, I can hardly wait for Judgment Day, because I've disregarded all the gifts of the Spirit that God has given me, and I've made my Christian service the task of beating on people to make them come to my way of thinking on what day to serve and what food to eat. And when I get to heaven, I got to convince God that I was right. Wouldn't that go well? Well, this all circles back to Matthew 7, 1 and 2. And it's about contempt. Now, as I said, this passage we're looking at is fairly straightforward. It doesn't matter if you eat or don't eat. It doesn't matter which day you worship or not worship. As long as you are content in your heart that this is God's will for you, you're good. It's neither good or bad, but some of these are not shared. You have to recognize the fact that everybody doesn't agree with you on these things. And it just isn't food. There's all sorts of other things. Should you dance or not dance? Should you drink or not drink? Should you date or not date? Should you go to the movies? Gordon Horseman, I love him. He's a great guy. Gordon Horseman, it was the Passion of the Christ, I think. Very seldom are there Christian movies in the theater, and I said to him, are you going to see this movie? And he said, Peter, I don't go to movies at the theater. This is something that I've never done, and I believe that God is, this is my gift to God. I don't go. But he was very careful not to say, Peter, this is the word of God, and you are in danger of death and destruction if you don't obey it. No, he didn't say that. He allowed me the freedom to go to the Passion without feeling guilty. But if he had have gone and been talked into it, he may have felt as he walked in, this is wrong, I shouldn't be doing this. And then for him, it was a sin. I told you about that, the man last week, Bruxy Caver. He was the speaker. And he loves movies. And he uses movies, illustrations, in his sermons. And he said, I love them because they're made up. They're like the parables. God made up the parables because they were crazy. He said no man would divide all his possessions and give it to the younger son. It just wouldn't happen. It had to be made up because he couldn't have used, Jesus didn't use examples of himself. Well, the disciples and I were in the Sea of Galilee, and no, he made these up. So, but he said, understand, I know that the next pastor is not going to do it this way. He's not going to make up, he's not going to use movies. It's just something I do. Well, there's other pastors who say, do not use an illustration of your own life. So I'll go back to the first of the sermon and I'll say, somebody in this past week, these things happened to, so it wasn't me. Don't use an illustration. Preach the gospel. Use the Bible. Don't use illustrations of your own life. And so they're very adamant that this is not something you should do, but it's one of those things. It's okay. In the same way that God didn't condemn drinking alcohol, he put rules and limits on it. Now, the rest of this chapter that I didn't read from 13 on down, it talks about don't let your freedom cause the destruction of another Christian. And he's going on to say that if you are happy with eating in this way, but another Christian isn't, for the time you're with him, maybe you just don't do that. Now, the last words are, his last words are, if you're not sure, don't do it. Give it, if you don't have faith, err on the side of caution. So what should we think about judging others? Because the Bible clearly condemns it and clearly advises us to do it. So I know what you're saying. You've put me between a rock and a hard place. I'm damned if I do and damned if I don't. If I don't judge, I'm sinning, and if I do judge, I'm sinning. So let's look at the most basic judging that people do. This is very simple. You can do it without even thinking, subconsciously. So you and I are having a conversation, and I go like this. You get the impression that I might be in a hurry and we need to finish the conversation up. And so there's all sorts of times when you're walking down the road and you see someone and you give them a wide margin because you just know they do not want to have any contact with you. You do it subconsciously. Well, that's a form of judging. I'm judging that this person does no longer want to talk to me, or any number of things. There are certain people with autism or something like that don't get that. They have no idea. They can't judge those signals that everyone else gets. And so people get mad at them. Don't you know, I'm telling you, by looking at my watch, that nope, didn't get that at all. Didn't read any of that. And there's some people that read it so good that if you put your eyebrow up, they know you're lying. And if you go like this, they know you're not, they've done it, they're so good at it, at picking up these signals, that they've made it into their own employment. It's a job for them, a career. Now, so here's the problem. This vexing question starts at one side over here that says, judge not that ye be not judged. In the same way you judge, it will be judged, you will be judged that way. So that's one side. And then in 1 Timothy 5:19 and 20, it says this, do not receive an accusation against an elder except on the basis of 2 or 3 witnesses. So what he's saying is, if there's an elder in your church and somebody says he did this and that, make sure that you are sure he did it. But then in verse 20 it says, and those who continue in sin rebuke in the presence of all, so that the rest may be fearful of sinning. What he's saying is, you judge that guy, and you make sure that everyone knows that he's being judged, and you do it in a way that no one mistakes it. It's a threat. Well, not only did he do that, tell us to do that, he went on to say in Galatians Galatians 2:11, he says, "But when Cephas," that's Peter, "came to Antioch, I opposed him to his face, because he stood condemned." See, what had happened is James sent some people from the church in Jerusalem to Antioch, and Peter, who had been eating with all the Gentiles, stopped and ate with just the Jews. And then some of the other Jews just ate with the Jews. And then Barnabas was pulled away. And then in verse 14, it said, "But when I saw that they were not straightforward about the truth of the gospel, I said to Cephas in the presence of all." And he goes on to say, "You got it wrong, buddy." What he did was, he's saying, so as I say, at one side of this spectrum is don't judge, and at the other side it's judge. Couple verses later, he says, be careful that you don't accept anyone as a leader too quickly. So what he's saying is you have a new person in the church. So you judge them, and 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 you judge them to the point where you say, this guy is serving God faithfully, we're going to make him a leader. And then he says, if a leader sins, he should be rejected as unfit to serve. So once he becomes a leader, you keep judging and judging and judging and judging in all his actions. So that's a whole lot of judging going on. On that Matthew 7:1 passage, I read some commentaries. I got that new Logos program, and I read some commentaries about that. And one of the commentaries said, this is not talking about a sane appraisal of their conduct based on your own and others' observations. Now, I'm going to give you a sane, what I consider a sane as I am, appraisal. Do you remember Madonna? She's still a singer. Madonna was very famous, and about 15 or 20 years ago, she decided to do something to increase her, how about everybody was talking about her. So she made a book of herself, and she sold each copy for $100, and the book was a totally pornographic book. It had her in every possible sexual thing with pictures of her doing each of these sexual acts. And I don't think, even without looking at the book, I don't think it's wrong to say, I don't think this behavior is becoming. And I think that it breaks all God's laws about sexual behavior. So I am judging her. And if you were her acquaintance and she said to you, look, your daughter's 14 or your son's 15, I'd like them to come to my house for a month and I guarantee you I'll show them a good time. You wouldn't be judging wrongly if you said, no, I think I'll decline that offer. He said the better understanding, the commentary said the better understanding of the text would be a hypocritical or self-righteous condemnation of another person. Contempt. Don't hold this person in contempt. An example would be a Southern Baptist preacher or a Southern Baptist Christian who owns a tobacco farm, and he lights a cigarette, and he says, those Lutheran, and they're drinking beer, that is wrong. They're going to hell. This kind of judging is what the Pharisees did. And they did these things, and Jesus said, this is definitely wrong what you're doing. But still they judged him. Do you remember the apostles were walking through a wheat field, and they picked and went like this and ate some of the grain. They were harvesting on the Sabbath. This was wrong. Now, I expect I could make up a long list of sins, and you could make up a long list of sins, and they wouldn't be exactly the same. And some of my sins I didn't include because I do them. And some of them be the same for you. And on top of that, if you want to make it even more hard to work through, is some sins aren't really sins at all. They're just sins for me. I struggle with that. And Gordon Horseman doesn't go to the movies. He would say that for him would be a sin. But it wouldn't be for Bruxy Carver. The problem, you see what I'm saying is that how do you manage to do all this when they're not the same? Now, here's an example from the news from this past week. A man was driving 180 to 190 kilometers an hour, and somehow they lost control of the car. His brother was killed in the accident, and the other passenger was hurt. And he was charged with reckless driving, because that's 110 miles an hour. That's too fast, not 65. And so what happened was, he was given 9 months in jail, and the family said, that's wrong. It was an accident. But I think it's safe to judge him as this was reckless behavior. Because the people at the court said it was. Well, there was this you may remember, 20 years ago at ABC, or ABU, one or the other, there was a man who was a professor there. Sept was driving the 15-passenger van full of ABU students, and he was racing with another car who had students in it, and they were going back and forth and passing each other on the Salisbury Road, which is not that great a road. And the police car he was going over 80 miles an hour in a 50. And so he was charged with reckless driving. He went to court. He said, yes, I agree that this was a foolish and dangerous thing. I should never have been egged on by the people in the van. I should never have done it. I fully admit my guilt. And so if you said that was foolish, you wouldn't be judging any more than he had already judged himself. Well, so if you looked at those, you would say, well, those aren't the Matthew 7:1 kind of judging that Jesus is talking about. I'll give you an example of that Matthew 1. You judge whether I'm right or not. I had to work this week installing doors, and I had a helper. And we were driving, and every time there was a driver in front of us that was too slow making a turn or too anything, he was angry. And he judged them as compared to his perfect level of driving. They were deficit. So he compared himself to them. They were not a very good driver, and he's super. Jay Leno says, all men think they're great drivers, but it's not true. And as he said this, and I was in the driver's seat, thinking to myself, you know, I do that too. We had one, and I started this. Somebody stops and goes really slow around the corner into a parking lot or into another street, and I said, they almost rolled their car. I'm judging. Matthew 7 just caught me unawares. Well, the takeaway from all this is that this judging is really easy to do. Sometimes you get it right, and sometimes you get it wrong, but it's really easy. And the kind that Jesus condemns is when you have contempt for the other person. You're doing it right, they're doing it wrong, and you can make yourself feel so much better at their expense. Well, In Romans 14:20, it comes down to the end of this. Do not tear down the work of God for the sake of food. That's the whole point of chapter 14. Live in harmony with your Christian friends, your Christian neighbors. Don't ruin God's church for the sake of food or the sake of should I go to a movie? Any of these things that may be sins for you but not for them gives people the ability to be God's servant and let him decide whether they stand or fall. You don't have to be God for them. Because if we do, we'll destroy the body of Christ. Let's pray. Lord Jesus, thank you for this